Okay, we're going to dive right into this whole Prony brake thing, and I'll talk a little bit about the Prony brake when we are setting this stuff up. Very first thing we need to remember is looking at the diagram, we have this bracket here lining up with the outside of this extrusion, likewise over here, this one touching the backside here. So if this is lined up here and here, and then these are touching, then I know that these rails are parallel. That's great. Next thing I need to do is loosen these up if they are not in position and measure from the edge of this foot out here to the end, and I should get exactly 7.5 inches. Now, measuring one side is not good enough. You're going to have to go over here and measure the other side, and I have exactly 7.5 inches. I'm going to measure that twice, and it actually looks like I'm slightly off here. So I'm going to go ahead and make a quick correction to this setup right here because I don't necessarily like the fact that it's a little off. So we're going to use a little extra torque here by having the short end in and the long end exposed, and then I'll be able to move this ever so slightly. So I'm going to re-measure and bring this up to exactly 7.5. And before I tighten it down, I'm going to check this and make sure, yes, it remains 7.5, so we are in very good shape. Gently, I'm going to snug this up, and then what I'm going to do is put the final torque on here. Okay, so now I have my rail set up the way we're going to set this up for the Prony exercise. Now, we talked a little bit about these extrusions and things like that, and how to bolt things up, and we're actually going to do it right now. What we need to do is we need to mount this motor essentially right here on this rail, somewhat in the center of this area here. How we're going to do it is we're going to select the right bolts first. The first thing we're going to do is take and make sure we have the right scale. I'm going to get in front of the camera real quick, and it looks like I have about 5/8 of an inch from the bottom of this to the top of that. That's going to be perfect because I have 5/8 bolts here, and once I put a flat washer on the bolt, it's going to give me the appropriate amount of spacing. Now, just like talking about before, if I don't, or if I want to, I can actually put the nuts in here and then try to line all that stuff up. But another strategy is, and I kind of like doing this, is going ahead and setting up my bolts here, putting them in, and starting the nut. Remember, the protrusion goes down. So I'm going to go ahead and start this, and just enough to keep the bolt actually engaged. So again, back to the washers and the nuts. I need to have enough in order to be able to do this job. So we're going to go ahead and do that right now. Again, we're going to take a washer, stick it over top of our bolt. We're going to find the other foot here, and then we are going to thread a nut on here. Now, you'll notice that these two nuts are different colors. You have a silver and a black. None of that matters. It's just whatever coating, and they were purchased separate from this particular lab, so no big deal. Again, I'm going through and putting a washer on my nut, or on my bolt, and then I am going to thread that nut right onto there with just a little bit. And then lastly, I'm going to do this one. Okay. Major caution to be taken with this motor to make sure it doesn't fall over on your fingers, and that could be a big problem. Now, again, you could put the nuts in there, try to line everything up. That's totally fine. I'm going to do it this way, this particular time. Now what I need to do is make sure that I have enough strength to do so, but I am going to bring this over to the end here, and while resting it on the extrusion, I can actually start these nuts right in. Perfect. I can bring it up a little closer, and there's enough of a slot in that to where I can slide those on. Now, I can put the motor wherever I need to. All right? Make sure the motor is semi-lined up right here using my fingers. I can actually spread these out, which is nice, so that I can get my wrench on it a little easier and tighten it up with my fingers first, which makes total sense because then I don't have to spend as much time readjusting my wrench. And I'm going to just snug all the way around. And once everything's snug and it looks good, then I'll go ahead and put the final torque. And again, we're not going to go terrible amount. We're only talking about a 5/16 bolt here. Now, the next portion that we're going to do, and we're going to do it in similar fashion, we need to break up here, break out our Prony brake. Now, if you look in the diagram, you're going to notice that it doesn't really show it, but the rotation is specific for which way the drum actually rotates in here. And how you get that is that this scale should be, when you're facing the motor, to the left. All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and slide it on. That, and the other thing is when we go to put it on, these stick out just a little farther than the frame, and you won't be able to slide it on this way without hitting the actual scale. So we're going to play the same game. We're going to rest this on here, rotate our T-nuts around lining those up. And if you find it a little difficult to slide it, that's no big deal. Oftentimes it just merely takes loosening up the nut ever so slightly, and then we can slide over. And then what we want to do is we want to try to get it straight for the camera. We want to try to get the center of this kind of over the center of the shaft. And once we've done that, we can do the same thing that we did for the motor, and we can begin to snug this thing down. If we like the results, then we can go ahead and take it to final torque. All right, so I'm going to finish this up a little bit and talk a little bit about what the Prony is. The Prony actually measures what they call brake horsepower, okay? So in a sense, it's kind of like a dyno, but not really like a dyno. But what we can do from the information taken from this Prony brake is figure out what kind of output we're getting in torque with the motor, RPM loss with a given amount of load, and then we can also determine what kind of efficiency we get for the amount of power that we're getting in versus what we're getting out of it. Now that we've already discovered that, now what we're going to do is actually put this guy on here, which is the drum, if you would, and that is what's going to be rubbing up against this belt here. So same thing applies to what we were talking about before. We need to make sure that we find a shaft key, and so I'm going to open up my little box over here of shaft keys, and I'm going to make sure that one is the appropriate fit. I'm going to stick it on here. We're going to play the same game, right? We're going to make sure that this is lining up. And then what we're going to do is maybe even have to hold the key a little bit. And then we might have to move the belt some. And then what we want to do is make sure we get good engagement. All right, but we don't want the belt all the way off the end, and then we want to make sure we have enough engagement with our shaft there. So I'm in a really good spot right here. And then what I'm going to do is find the recessed set screw. Now a recessed set screw, the reason I say recessed is because that thing is way down in there. So you're going to have to get your Allen wrench in there, the appropriate size. This one happens to be an 1/8 inch. And then what I'm going to do is crank that over with my fingers. And I'm probably just going to have to put as much as I can on there with my fingers there to make sure that's tightened up. And I shouldn't be able to pull it off. Okay, so we're in great shape right now. We're almost ready to go ahead and start this. Now, there's a few things that you need to keep in mind with it. Thing one is we need to fill this up with water. So I'm going to walk over here very quickly. I actually have water in this particular spray thing. So what we're going to do is we're just going to keep spraying this in. I really should have something different to do this, but I'm going to keep going until most of the bottom is taken up with water. And so what I'm doing with this is I'm putting a cooling agent inside of here. So as this is rubbing around the outside during my experiment, then it's going to dissipate the heat by the evaporative cooling. We're not going to get into that there. Now, the last thing that we're going to do, and what the actual experiment is we're going to take a look at the RPM of this using a tachometer. Now, you'll notice that at the front of this thing, you actually have some black tape here. What that does is it blocks all of the shiny surfaces except for one. That way, when you use your tachometer here, take this tachometer and you make sure that it's on photo, and you push this button here, it's going to cast a light, and every time this goes around and hits that light, it's going to give you a value. Right now, it's showing me that it's doing roughly about 100 RPMs. Okay, so we're going to actually see what that is. So we're going to, without any load on this, we're going to go ahead and take an RPM measurement to find out with no load. And then what we're going to do is while this thing is running, so again, very important that this is actually running at this time, you're going to start using this wing nut here to apply some pressure. Now, as this thing is rotating, it's going to start to actually pull on this a little bit with the drag. So it's important that it's running. So you've got to be ready to take your measurements, and you're going to crank this thing up to the value specified. The value specified is going to be half because you have two of these. Both of these springs are putting the load. So if you're looking for 8 ounces, you need to put them both at 4 ounces with this right here, and then go back and take the RPM reading. Then you're going to move on. You make the adjustment to the other appropriate value, take your reading, and so on and so forth. We don't want to spend a whole lot of time with this thing just rubbing, because that's just going to generate unnecessary heat. All right, once you take those data points, then you'll be able to do your calculations, but this right here is exactly how you would set this up, and taking it apart is the exact reverse. Just make sure that when you pull this drum off of here, you know you have water in it, and that way you don't make a mess.